Good afternoon. We're going to call this meeting to order. Appreciate everybody coming back. I think it's been less than a week since we were last here. So we are going to go ahead and get started, but I do want to remember this week that we will accept public comments at the end of our discussion if there's still time. So I believe there are slips at the front of the room. If anyone would like to submit any, they can do that. We are going to skip the minutes. They haven't been distributed yet, so we'll either look at them tomorrow or next week from last week's meeting as well as this meeting. So we're going to move straight on to the summary of public comments that we've received to date.
Chair Poe, members of the committee, in front of you should be a list of public comment for the entirety of our accepting time of comment, and hard copies of the public comments submitted from last week's meeting until today are in front of you as well. On the Charter Review Committee website at columbus.gov, there's an entire list and copies of all public comment that's been made available to the public as well. So,
Any questions or comments about the public comments? Okay. This is where I'm going to take things a little out of order. We have the discussion of the draft language on the size and structure of council that we discussed last week, and staff has put together some draft language, but I'm going to cover that after we talk a little bit about vacancies and appointments and full-time versus part-time. I just want to make sure we get to the heart of some of those issues, and then we can fine-tune the language and the specific recommendations as we go forward. So we're going to switch the order of items 4 and 5 and start with vacancies and appointments. Which, as we went through this process, from my perspective, I think the interest and comments were pretty significant around the vacancy and appointment process. So I thought, in order to try to come up with some recommendations, I kind of wanted to start with a suggestion that it seemed like to me, and maybe as we learned last week I get this slightly wrong, but it seemed to me that figuring out a way to make the process more transparent to everyone involved seemed to be a critical component. And secondly, the idea of having some type of public hearing so the public had an opportunity to be more engaged in the process seemed to be something everyone was interested in, regardless of what else we do or don't do as far as recommendations. I felt like those were things that at least most people seemed to think were important. So one of my thoughts was that as we tried to narrow down, as we saw at the end of last week's meeting, what are we asking staff to draft language around, and making that clear that maybe we start with that idea of a public process that would require city council to at least have some version of who they select, whether that be one person as a finalist or 5 finalists or whatever that looks like, go through a public hearing process. So I kind of wanted to start with that idea, and then we'll move in. I'm not in any way saying there aren't other ideas. We can still talk about, and I want to talk about all of the different versions of things we heard from different areas, but is that an idea that did I misinterpret people's focus and interest? To kind of get some feedback on that, and then we'll move into other specific parts of that process. So. John.
I'll comment only by saying that the importance of transparency relates to who's being appointed. If it's a placeholder, it seems to me there's less pomp and circumstance that surrounds the selection of the person best to assume the seat. But if in fact they end up being an incumbent, that's a little bigger deal and requires greater scrutiny, thus more transparency.
What do you say, even if they were a placeholder, and I'm assuming by that you mean the idea of a caretaker or not able to run
Yeah, that's right.
in the next
Exactly.
election, they still could be a member of city council for a period of time.
Absolutely, and they'd be voting and all that. I just think the concern ramps up.
Yes.
Based upon which we're doing.
Yes, got ya. Are you opposed to a public process or
Of course
addressing that
not.
issue of? I didn't think so. Just wanted to clarify. Anybody else have comments or thoughts on that aspect before we delve into the how do we get to the person that is, or what are they do? Either one, I think.
The concern that I would have is, I'm all for a public process, but I would be concerned about the applicant, and to make sure that our process doesn't prevent people from wanting to apply. Because once we start talking about the public process, I immediately think, who's asking the questions? You know, who's doing the interviewing? Because then that can be subjected to the criticism of stacked deck. You know, we don't want to put people through a brutal public process. I know we want to have a public process, but I think we should also be considerate of the applicants because we haven't done it before. You know, we've elected council members to make decisions on behalf of the city. So I know before we had talked about adding people to that process, and we would have to consider that because then it's who's selected. So, I mean, I'm not opposed to a public process. I just think we should be sensitive to what we're creating for the applicant.
Definitely. Carrie?
Yeah, I would echo that. You know, I think there's some opportunity to improve the transparency component of the appointment process, but I do think you reach a point where you I don't want to see us go so far that we would deter qualified applicants from going through, you know, potentially an appointment process that could be more rigorous and more publicly challenging than some much other higher offices in the land. So I think that's right. I also just want to reiterate what I said at the last working group session, which is we have a limited capacity here to make constructive changes in this area because, in my view, most of the criticism around the appointment process is more directed at the political process of county party endorsements, endorsements from sitting elected officials. Those are running as slate cards. Those are all things that are going to be done outside of this process, and very little that we could recommend will affect that. I'm very much interested in improving some of the transparency components of how an appointment process is made, but I'm also just concerned that by trying to do too much, we end up setting a false expectation for the citizens of Columbus about what this is going to look like, given the fact that we can't control, nor can we make recommendations to, well, I suppose we could, but our scope is not to reform the political process, it's to reform what we can do within the charter to make this process more open and public. So I just want to reiterate that note. I know I made it last time, but it bears repeating.
Yes, it does.
I would definitely echo that as well. Any other comments, Fred?
I don't have a comment, but I know we've gone through this at least twice, but while we're talking about it, could someone, Brian Edward, explain what happens today? I know that at least the candidate comes before council, but why don't you go ahead and explain once again?
And I actually had a comment about that because at a certain point, their names are public, right? Everyone who applies is public, and then finalists are public as well. And I'm correct as part of that process. Part of the reason I was just pointing that out, just because I think, to your point, I think we have seen, whether it was people who are part of the process, applicants, or even people who were appointed to the administration, you know, if when you dig a little beneath the surface, there have been, you know, news reports or things that people have uncovered that might be somewhat scandalous or whatever, which I think is inherent to the process itself.
Well, let me just clarify what I was saying earlier, too, before you explained the process. I wasn't necessarily even saying that we should make very specific recommendations that would tie council to a very specific set of processes or a lot of hurdles for applicants to jump through. But I think when they explain today's process, there's not really an opportunity for the public to see that candidate interviewed or answer any questions really, typically, from my experience. So kind of creating like that public hearing where if council's narrowed it down to 2, 5, 1, whatever the number would, whatever they decide their process is, that there would be some opportunity for the citizens to see and hear what that applicant thinks. So maybe if you explain the process, you could kind of articulate how that fits in.
Chair, co-members of the committee, currently, once a vacancy is effective, council has 30 days to fill that vacancy. What typically happens is the application process is open for approximately 2 weeks, which is half of that time period, at which time it's closed. All of the names are a matter of public record, and the applications themselves are also a matter of public record, so those tend to be requested by the media as well. What happens is council members will review those, decide, I'm interested in sitting down and discussing, certain issues with these applicants. Sometimes those interview processes can happen with more than one member in the room. Members get together, kind of talk, and then they kind of send their decisions to the president's office about who they would prefer in terms of how that decision-making is done within a 30-day timeframe.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, please.
So just to make it clear that the last part of that process, the interviews, making the president aware of who your choice would be, that is not transparent at this point. Or maybe a better way to say it is that that's done privately.
Those are not open meetings
Right,
necessarily.
that's,
yes.
okay.
I was going to say, just, I think to clarify, just in my own experience, council would typically meet, go into executive session, and then conduct interviews of any number of people. So in my experience, sometimes individual members interviewed people before they narrowed the list down, and then once, that was always just an individual member, and then once they had a narrowed down list, then council would meet, go into executive session, and then interview however many people that they had narrowed it down to, and then ultimately there was a public vote, but I'm assuming behind the scenes people have indicated who they're interested in. Is that fair? Brian, you want to add anything to that?
Chair Coe, members of the committee, I think that's an accurate reflection of historically how it's been done. I think I can speak to, going back about 6 years in terms of appointments. What typically happened then is each council member would forward a single name to the council president's office. All those individuals were interviewed in executive session. So council gave a public notice for that meeting, said that the purpose of the meeting, went into executive session, came out, stated what they had done. I would say that that entire process is very similar to what we saw in other cities that have an appointment process. What is different is the addition of a single public hearing where a finalist or finalists, plural, would stand before council only, answer questions from council, and the public would be there to hear those answers. So it's less about a full vetting hearing that you might see on C-SPAN and more about asking specific public questions of the same individuals in a public hearing. It's also important to note that from, I think, day one, we provide all the data that's provided. So the resumes, the questionnaire that council requires, that's all public record, which is why you see sort of the list of people and occupations usually in the dispatch the day after that week closes.
Please.
Just because I didn't hear it if you said it, and I apologize. But that last part that you just said where they go before council, is that part of the current process now?
No, it's not.
It is not, okay.
That's kind of what I'm
Yeah,
saying, that I
right,
think
right,
if we add some element that requires some discussion that the public can at least hear, then maybe it would make more sense why council ultimately selects candidate A over B, that people just generally, in the way the process has worked for the last few years, don't hear. I mean, maybe things came out in the interviews that made this the best choice, but I think that with the lack of transparency, or the feeling of the lack of transparency, you don't know. There's just this quick vote saying so-and-so, and you don't necessarily know much about that person in many instances until they've already been appointed. So, give another.
This is a little different. I thought when we talked about it earlier, but I know we've talked about it a couple of times, I was under the impression that we were going forward for this public comment period to allow citizens to question the candidates. That's what I had heard prior to, I'm so sorry. And that was my concern. So from what you've said, Brian, that's different from what I remember us discussing at prior meetings, because I specifically remember the opening this up so that the public would have an opportunity to question the candidates, and that's what I was concerned about. So I want to
think
be
we could
clear
all-
on that.
We definitely talked about both. I mean, that was
Okay.
my recollection.
Okay.
And I think we could recommend either or both. My thought is to recommend that there be a public hearing and then allow council the opportunity to determine, because I don't think this current council has appointed anyone yet as they're currently sitting. So, or at least close to it. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But the point being that allow this council the opportunity to decide what the process will be, but just at least putting into the charter that there would be, at a minimum, a public hearing. They could decide along the way that it's they only question people. They could decide public questions can be submitted. I don't know. I mean, leave that up to council to kind of control their own process, but at least the charter would require them to have some public hearing of some nature. And I guess the other part to that would be, as we went through this, 30 days is not a particularly long time. I mean, when you're talking about getting applicants and all those kinds of things, you know, I'm a little worried about, is that really enough time to get everyone who might be interested to have time to think about that and to submit all the paperwork as well as prepare? And if we added a public hearing, you clearly would want to give them more
Well, they
time.
have 30 days for the decision, not
No.
30 days to apply, right?
30 days from the whole point. When there's a when there's a vacancy, they have 30 days to fill it.
Got it, yeah.
So
yeah,
whatever
got it.
your process is from the point of someone's resignation or,
Chair Coe, once the resignation is effective, that 30-day trigger kicks in. And so I think to your point, should the committee decide to recommend a public process, current law would require council give 2 weeks' notice that they're going to have a public hearing.
Right.
And so you might be kind of compacting that schedule a little bit without.
the point being, I think you have
Additional
to
time.
extend that and change the charter to allow 45 or 60 days from that point, because I don't know how you would actually get that whole process to
14
go
of those
through.
30 days is just the application process.
Currently,
Currently.
yeah.
I think it depends on the time of the resignation. I mean, you know, it's just like employment. If someone's resigning and they give you 30 days, and you know 30 days before the effective date of the resignation, but we don't know. I mean, someone could resign today and be gone tomorrow. So that timing does come into play, but I'm just thinking that it's not always the next day the 30-day clock starts ticking.
Well, if I understand correctly, nothing about the timing says it has to take 30 days or 45 or 60. It just says it has to be done within that time. So if you knew ahead of time, you could have the whole process going and make a decision long before 45 or 60 days passes.
So we don't know.
We won't know on any individual situation,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something, Brian?
If I could just add a few things, Chair Coe and members of the committee. Committee member Bradley, you're correct that most of the public processes are not public to applicant. They're the public providing comment to council after they've heard the applicant speak or providing written comment, very similar to what council currently does under its current rules, and that's the way that it's been borne out in other cities. The other thing that Edward was just noting, the way that our charter is written, the clock begins, the entire clock and process begins the date and a vacancy is effective. So even if we knew that a person was going to be leaving office at a certain time, council couldn't begin any of that process prior to that. There are some charters that are a little bit different, and they do allow advance notice of a vacancy, and they do allow the council to begin the process earlier, but there are some, I think, some challenges with that process as well. It presumes that the individual is in fact leaving and that there would be no change to the effective date. It's not as clean as the current process under our charter.
Any other thoughts on this idea?
Well, I would just add, you know, conceptually, if we're thinking about adding if this is the formation of a recommendation, one component of a recommendation perhaps on this, I would be more inclined to support a hearing before council on a prospective candidate if it were a confirmation hearing, as opposed to sort of like you have the top 3 finalists come before council and have, 3 individual question and answer sessions or all 3 together. I don't know if I'd be supportive of that. I think I would like to see us think about a recommendation that would essentially allow council in some way to nominate and then have them come before the public hearing to confirm that nomination. I just think that if you are essentially asking the 3 finalists or top 2 finalists to come before council and have sort of a public interview process, I feel like that would deter quality candidates from coming forward. that would be a unique process where you essentially have a public final interview phase. So that's just my inclination.
Can you clarify what you mean by confirmation? How that would practically work?
Essentially,
I'm not following.
essentially, my thinking is, and, you know, council would essentially nominate, and then before that nomination could be authenticated, if you will, there would have to be this kind of public confirmation process in which they would have the candidate come before, much like we're seeing, you know, in DC today, where, you know, the council, you know, concludes their final recommendation, but before that nomination can be, you know, taken action on, there has to be this final public hearing.
So what you're, sorry, so I just want to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is that council members would go through whatever process they go through currently or changed, narrow it down to one person. Then that person would have some type of public hearing, and then council would vote on their one person. I think we're in essence saying the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
I just didn't want it to be like, council would get their top 3 list, and all 3 would come before council and face this sort of public interview process, where you'd have one person who would get the nomination, and then 2 that would, you know, essentially be, you know, not given the opportunity to serve. I think that bar is probably a little too high, and probably wouldn't serve this, it wouldn't satisfy the concerns that have brought us to this question.
so in trying to think through how we hopefully don't get to 4:30 today and try to figure out what to tell staff, what I was thinking was that we would, again, narrowing this down, that I think there's a lot more conversation and dialogue about how we get to the person and what their role will be, let's just say. But it sounds like so far what I'm hearing is some version of there being some hearing that is injected into this current sort of council process. People seem generally to be in favor of, I'm not sure, I see some head shaking, but are definitely concerned about sort of how much that puts the applicants under undue pressure or deters a viable candidate. So maybe we need to sort of give staff some direction of language that would support this idea of a public hearing, but maybe not so drastic that it requires, you know, X hours of testimony or anything that forces the process to be more complicated. And I think along the same lines, again, there would have to be a charter amendment to change the timing, but I don't see how you even try to have a public hearing without some additional time, because you're going to run out of notice time, would be my concern. So even if we want them to have a hearing, and we didn't write that into the charter, if we want them to have a hearing, we'd have to change the charter to give them more time to even do that if they did it voluntarily. Does that make sense? Is that making sense? Okay, so, please.
Brian, you were saying, because I was, you know, we've gone back and forth. I understand what you're saying about, because we're sharing the same concern. But we had talked about, from Brian, you were saying that a possible alternative was to have those final 3 candidates. After those final 3 candidates were selected, the public would get to comment. Did I hear you correctly that you were saying at one process that had been presented in your findings?
Chair, co-members of the committee, that would be correct. The general process that we've seen in other cities is following the typical council process of receiving public comment, like you would on an ordinance, 3 for, 3 against, and then the ability to send in written comment to the chair of that given committee. And there being some space, I will say there, in these cities, there's some space between the public hearing and the final decision by council. So it would not be a hearing and then immediately a vote in that same meeting.
So do they accept public comments? Is it only like written comments that are presented after the hearing? Or do
I believe
they?
it's in San Diego County and then also in Seattle. They would both accept verbal comments at that hearing. That wouldn't necessarily be required to have a public process, but they would also accept these written comments emailed in or provided in hard copy to the council.
Okay, refresh my memory. Council can interview applicants in executive session under state law. Has that been a change?
That's still an allowable use of executive session.
And that is because it's personnel matters? Okay. So that again is those are the types of things that I'm concerned about. It is an interview process, it is an application process of protecting the applicant. So, Chairman Coe, that's, some of these things we have to remember. I want a public process, I appreciate that, but, let's
I guess where I
be
agree with
cognizant,
you. But after the vote, they're now a council member. So yes, I want to protect the applicant, but I also think there's some limitation to, they're now going to be a public official, they're now going to represent the city. So
Yes,
that's where I
but-
kind of think there should be
yes.
some process. I do agree,
Yeah,
like,
I'm just, I understand I understand totally, I guess, but having seen some of these public roadshows go wrong, and we lose candidates because of that, and other entities and I'm just saying we have to think this through. It's good, but we do have to look the details of this to not only protect a public process, but also protect the applicant. That's why I was concerned about the questions.
and I guess what I'm thinking is, if we add in that there be a requirement for a public hearing, then how that hearing's structured, we're not dictating. Council can use their processes to decide they're not going to accept any public questions. They're going to just take written comments, or they're going to accept public comment but no questions for the applicant. I mean, I think council could then decide, as long as they applied it consistently, so one candidate wouldn't be treated differently than another candidate, that they could really have any process they would want. I would, and I guess when I was thinking about this, I would hope as all this has happened that maybe council would do this anyways. But then I was thinking about the timing, that even if they were to voluntarily say, hey, let's have a public hearing as part of this, I don't think there's enough time to have a public hearing.
So I just want to say, in hearing this conversation, two things, two thoughts that I have. One is, I was unclear on the personnel issue. I don't think that I necessarily, I don't know that, I would not say that it is common knowledge probably that people think of it that way, that it is a personnel issue and, you're getting hired for a job. I think that people think of it as you're now a public official and you were put in this position that ordinarily I would get to vote on and I did not have a say, right? Now, granted, you can get a say later, but I did not have a say now. So I think that's one. Two, I think along those same, and I know that we're talking about broader language, but I also feel like if you're going to be a public official and you're running a campaign, campaigns are hard. People don't take it easy on you. They're not like, oh, yay, you're going to run and we're going to be so fully supportive of you. I mean, it's difficult to run, and I think there is a certain level of public scrutiny if you're going to put yourself out there, right? It depends on when it comes. It may not come in the appointment process, but it may come afterwards when you actually go to run. So I do think that some element of, and why you're sitting, right, in your seat. But I do think that some element of having, maybe it's not actual questions, maybe it's a statement that each one of the finalists read or something, but I do think that having that, at least a portion of that, feel accessible to the people, I think, again, goes back to what the public has wanted. And I also think that the understanding of that process, again, I don't feel like thinking about it as a personnel job issue or job, all of that language that we just talked about, again, I do not think that the majority of people understand it to be that way.
I'm not even sure the majority of people know that's what happens, in the sense that I think what we've seen, at least in the last 6 or 7 years, that there's a list of people who submitted applications and there's a 5-minute vote in which someone's named to council. And I'm not sure the general public even understands that there were typically, at least in my experience, individual interviews, whole group interviews that sometimes are extensive. I don't think that's even known. So I just feel like, to Carrie's point earlier, a lot of this underlying real root cause are things we're not going to be able to change. It's about the political process and all those things that we really don't have the ability, and are definitely outside the scope, let's say. But I feel like even just somehow of making it more clear that there was a process, that there is some questions, who is this person, what can they say before we just hear a vote, I think would help a little bit. I know there's still going to be the political issues that that's not going to help, but at least there would be something more. And more concrete, I think, than today. So my thought is to ask staff to try to, again, put together language from all of our thoughts as they've said here around some public hearing and some extension of time. So there could even be a public hearing if they wanted it.
I also think that that public portion, going back to some of the things that we were talking about before, I mean, I think that could add to the competitiveness of the following election. Because if we're saying that people do not have visibility or they don't have name recognition, if you've gone before council and you've pled you've made this statement or you've gone through some sort of public process, I mean, then people will begin to understand who you are. And so even if you're not appointed in that process, if you go to run the next process, at least you have some sort of recognition and people understand who you are or what you've stood for because you've gone through that process.
I think it's good. I mean, I'm not denying that. I'm just hoping we tailor it, because all we get now, basically, we get the list of names and then speculation from the media and background, and that's fine too. And it is a good opportunity for that person to present his or her qualifications to the public. I just want to make sure that they are not subjected to unnecessary.
It's been more quiet over here than I would expect, so I'm going to turn this way, John. Okay.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think the notion of handing it on to staff to try to fashion something. Brian said something that I was very attracted to, and that was the notion you don't announce and approve the same night. That's pretty powerful for me. Because if some citizen feels pretty strongly about it, they can show up and petition council and ask some pretty pointed questions before the final vote is taken. I think that's a healthy thing. So I hope in your thinking you'll give some consideration to that.
I agree with that. Fred, anything? Agreed.
I'm all with you.
All right. So do we have a motion to ask staff to draft language? And again, just to clarify, this is purely to ask them to draft language and give them some general guidance. Once we have specific language, we will ultimately vote on our support or not support of the language. And I'm assuming there's a lot more to this discussion, so I'm not in any way saying this topic is over. This is just a part of it. So is there a motion to ask staff to, wait, does staff understand what we're asking? I saw that questioning look again.
Chair Coe.
Yeah.
I do believe we understand where you're going. One point of clarification we wanted to put out there is typically in the past, the vote for a appointment does happen during a council meeting. And so typically those hearings happen Tuesday through Friday. So there would kind of be that natural, at least by custom thus far, there's that natural cooling off period between we sat down and spoke with someone and now we're going to take a decision up.
Well, I think in the way it's been done, that has happened. But again, all the public sees is names to the dispatch, vote. So I think what we're asking here is that if you're going to build in a public hearing, that the vote would not occur on the same night as the public hearing, that there would be some period to allow for, at a minimum, the submission of public comments, if even just written, but at a minimum that people have an opportunity to have heard and then submit statements or, do whatever they're going to do. Okay, so is there a motion, or go ahead.
I'm trying to remember. Don't the applicants submit why I want to serve on city council?
Usually like a little essay.
Yeah, like a 500-word essay. Yeah, okay. I just thought that was,
We had to do that.
I know.
It was kind of,
If we have to do it,
Reminded
everybody
me
has to do
of-
it, darn it.
well, it reminded me of what I did on my summer vacation.
No, but I didn't hear that part when we were talking about the process, but all joking aside,
I think there's been
people
a
do
question
submit.
presented. I think it was a slightly different question, but
I thought it was just the basic why I wanted to serve. I don't think it changes.
at one point it was like the top 3 things the city faces or something like that. Yeah. Yes.
What I'm voting on,
Okay.
we've charged them with process. We've not given guidance on this question of placeholder versus.
No, we're still
Not
going to talk
yet.
about that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
This is purely just whatever way we get to a person, we want a public hearing and some extended time. And I
I
think,
may
what-
make that motion.
okay, is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, so we've got one charge for staff. And I think both of those would be charter amendments based upon requiring a public hearing and extension of time. And maybe you guys can look at, is 45 the right answer or 60? I think at minimum 45 to allow that notice, but you can give us some guidance on that. Okay, now to what I think is the meat of this discussion. Sort of, I think Brian could summarize them all for us, but we've seen a number of examples of ways in which cities and other municipalities fill vacancies. How does everyone feel? Do we want Brian or anyone to summarize some of that again, or you just want to kind of start with your thoughts? Is everyone comfortable enough to go through their thoughts? John, I'm sure you have some. Are you going to? You have made up your mind? Okay, you've made up your mind. All right, good. We'll start there.
Well, it's a pretty short list of potentials. I mean, you got a real for sure person. You've got the placeholder who doesn't stand for election. And there was some talk about, you like to call him the first loser, I like to call him the first runner-up. I'll chase that card just for a moment. I've thought a lot about the first runner-up, which frankly I was attracted to a lot. But I start to get into different fact patterns, and sometimes I don't like the result. And I said to you before, I think I could draw it, but nobody ever understand it. I could put it on paper, I just don't think we ever explain it to anybody. It makes sense. So I've stepped back from this notion of first runner-up. But I'll press ahead and say that I think it should be a placeholder. And Brian gave us some statistics on the competitiveness of elections and the spread between the first runner-up and the last winner, if I can call it that. And it's not a complete gulf. I mean, sometimes the other side's within striking distance. And I think in those circumstances, wearing the incumbent hat makes a difference. And I will be perfectly clear about this. I think it's good government that we have somebody of a different flavor from time to time on council. I'll just say that to you, flat out. And I don't care whether they're a member of the Green Party, I think the fact that there is sometimes somebody of a different flavor is a healthy thing for us, and if you go to that conclusion, if we're about to make a decision that gives somebody even a little edge sometimes, then that's a step in the wrong direction. So I'm all for the placeholder, can't stand for election to the office. I've had this conversation with Edward. We talk about how long somebody might be asked to serve. I guess in theory, it could be as long as 2 years. In practice, it likely won't. I said to him, that's even something I would do. But it's not too long. But the fact remains is I think there are people who in fact would serve for a reasonable period of time. And I think the system would benefit from not bestowing incumbency on somebody in this circumstance.
Just to clarify, would you want the language to say that they could never run for a seat on city council, or they could not run in that election to fill that seat?
That's exactly right.
So you want to limit it to the particular seat they're basically appointed to, or the term in which, so like, we elect 3 and 4 currently.
I think we have to at least talk about an open seat in the same election cycle.
Yes.
I mean, they have to set out the election cycle, period. They can't pursue another seat.
Within the 3 or 4.
That's right.
Yeah, so you're talking about out an election cycle, basically. Okay, any other, I'm guessing there's more thoughts, so anybody, Carrie?
I'm keeping an open mind on this. My background is that I come from the state legislature. That's where I've that's where I've spent most of my career from a legislative perspective. One of the challenges in the state legislature is it takes a while to get to know the system. Some of that experience is invaluable. Term limits have created a challenge where lawmakers who are charged with making important policy decisions haven't had a great opportunity at a certain point to really understand the complexity of state government. So I think the idea that we would have new voices in council is important, and if you had a caretaker provision in place in which you had somebody in for a small period of time and then they rotated out for the person that was elected, I can see some value in that. But I compare that against the value of having someone who not only knows city government well and is able to make informed policy decisions about city government, but also I go back to what we talked about at a previous meeting, which is right now we have a relatively new city council who hasn't had yet the opportunity to really really kind of build those kind of community relationships and allow people to get to know them, perhaps as a, you know, as an alternative to a council that had been around for many, many years, or council members that had been around for many, many years. So I do worry a little bit that if you create a scenario in which you have people coming on and off of council as a result of a caretaker provision, you end up limiting the level of experience amongst our policymakers. And then two, you end up potentially sowing even perhaps a little more confusion about who the right person to contact is. And, you know, you limit the amount of time that council can really build those relationships within certain pockets of the community. So as I said, I'm keeping an open mind on it. I haven't made a firm conclusion one way or the other, but I do think, you know, those are the things that I'm contemplating as I, you know, think about this conversation.
I'm keeping an open mind as well. And when I thought about the caretaker, you know, we have talked about the power of the incumbency. And the caretaker, although it would prohibit that person from running that particular year, that person would still have 2 years of name ID and in the position. So it's, to me, I'm saying it's an idea, but it doesn't totally clear it, because the very next year, this person could run, possibly, and you still have that. So some of the, and I agree with you, that some of the, we're trying to make things open and fair, but there's just certain parts of this political process it's hard to work around. And that's what I thought about when I was thinking about the caretaker. It's an immediate problem. It solves that immediate, but it creates that other, because it could be the same. You know, it's not that position, but it would still be an incumbency at 2 years of name ID and all of that. So we have to just weigh some of this stuff.
Yeah. I struggle with whatever period of time they would fill that, they're aware they don't ever have to stand for election, potentially. I mean, they could run afterwards, but they don't have to. So we have someone who is one vote on council making decisions knowing that there won't necessarily be any accountability to the community. Now, I understand that people who appointed them may eat the accountability for their choices too, but you know, there's still this person that knows from the beginning they don't have to stand for election in their decision making. That may be good, and that may give them. That'll
give them an edge.
I'm not saying it may very well be good, but it also may not. I mean, that's sort of the problem with all of this. Is I worry a little bit that as we mandate something or write it into the charter, then until there's a process in which to change the charter again, you're kind of stuck with what that means, and it could be good or bad. I can see that either way. I think, like Carrie and Jeanette have said, I'm not sure where I totally feel about this. I would agree with you on the first runner-up scenario. I mean, conceptually, the first night it was said, it kind of made sense until you think through what that looks like. So, I mean, I don't necessarily see that. I'm not really hearing from anyone else that that's sort of, you know, the path we're going down. I think it is a lot more discussion about this caretaker or placeholder, however you want to articulate that. Did you have something you wanted to add?
How do we select the caretaker?
Same way.
I mean, but we're back, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I'm just putting it out there. I mean,
And,
we go through the same process
I'm sorry.
as a full appointment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay.
And the placeholder, do we determine when you have a placeholder? Meaning.
That's another part of the discussion.
Right, okay, so like if there was 3 months left or something and you left, would you have to have a placeholder
Correct me
at
if
that
I'm
point?
wrong,
or-
but I think we could craft language that could say, you know, if your seat is vacated at some point between, I think it's the first 2 years, that you would then, there'd be an election, a special municipal election, am I saying that right?
That's still the
I'm
rule,
trying to
right?
learn. That there
Period.
could be.
No
We could
change.
also change it to say I mean, you could change it to say there isn't, and they could serve the entire term, right?
And why would we do that?
And I think that's sort of the question. I mean, the other thing that came up was just requiring it to be like the next election. And I think we went through with a lot of detail why that practically doesn't work. Sounds great. And I think the issue is municipal elections and the partisan issue. So you really kind of have to wait to that second year. And then I think there's also the cost issue that I don't think we want to ignore, that special elections costs a lot of money. So I think we can narrow this down, but what you're probably talking about is if someone resigns within the first 2 years of their term, there would be a special municipal election, so they would finish up to 2 years.
Right.
Or if they resigned in the second half of a 4-year term, they would then just be the election, but they wouldn't, what John is saying is they wouldn't be able to run in either one of those
Right.
two scenarios. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, you were gonna say something, I thought.
I was just. The one thing that I would point out, just from a practical running elections perspective, there is a real difference between that unexpired term, midterm election, if you will. So if someone steps down within the first 2 years of their term, they stand for a head-to-head special election concurrent with our municipal elections. That's a very different animal, and we see that across the country, than a field race, which is what they would face if they step down in the final 2 years of their term. And then to your question about being able to tailor it to when the vacancy happened, that's exactly what San Diego does. If it's, I believe it's within 11 months of the end of the term, the person would be ineligible to run. So, thinking through the mechanics of that, they don't want a person to have the power of incumbency at the same time that they're running for office. So potentially having an individual stepping down after a primary, having another person appointed, and then that individual appear on the November ballot.
Does that make sense to everyone? I had to think about that for a second. So they would allow someone who's appointed like in the first 3 years to run in the next election.
If they allowed appointments, they actually do special elections at that point, but were they to allow appointments, that individual would be able to run. Their focus, as we understand it, looking at the history of that, and it is a very contentious section of their charter, their desire was to make sure that in a election year, you did not confer additional incumbency on a candidate. Because I believe that historically the challenge there was an individual stepping down in an election year and then a person who was already on the ballot being appointed to fill that seat, if you will.
So that's kind of a middle ground between completely saying they can't run anytime and allowing them to run always, if I'm following. So, Fred?
Well, in the San Diego case, if it's within the 2 years, they have special elections, is what you're saying. If we do not have, if Columbus does not have special elections, then you're giving that person the leg up through incumbency in either scenario. So my opinion would be that Mr. Rosenberger's motion should be in either, or your opinion, I'm not telling you what you should opine, but that it should be in both cases, because I think the public has objected to that. Give that person the power of incumbency, you give them a leg up, they're part of the slate, et cetera. So my personal opinion would be it should be in either case, whether it's for 3 years or 3 months, it's a placeholder.
I think that's where John is too.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Carrie?
I just want to say that, the idea that the incumbency provides a significant electoral advantage is not something I really agree with, because in the scenario in which you had a placeholder, there would still be a political process by which the party would and the elected officials, the incumbent elected officials, would most likely endorse a candidate for that position. And if it were a field race, or I guess a head-to-head potentially, you would have the same dynamic play out where you would have, yes, you'd have a caretaker in place, but you would still have, let's say, the 3 incumbent council members running for reelection with, on the same ticket and same slate card as the endorsed, presumably this, the endorsed candidate. That's the real power of it. The ability for them to raise money collectively as a slate, to be on the slate cards and literature, to be on the county endorsed card. That's where the real power comes from, and that's where I think a lot of the frustration is coming from. To me, and this is just my opinion, but whether or not that slate card is filled out with someone who has been appointed for a year or 2 or 3, or they're fresh off, the street and just entering political life. What gives them that power is the fundraising advantage and the political endorsement process and the ability to run together with the other incumbents. So I think that, again, if we were to do this, you might bring a fresh voice into the committee, into the council process. You could get some fresh perspective for a very limited period of time. But I don't think it's going to address the heart of the matter that has brought this question to this table, which is, folks feeling like if you're an independent person who just, wants to get involved in the political process, you don't really have, an equal opportunity to get elected when you're running against, the party, frankly. And so I just don't want to try to solve a problem that we can't control and end up, in my view, potentially creating challenges where you've got people coming on and off council, that limits the ability time people can get to know the community and the issues. So I just have a little reluctance from that perspective.
And Carrie, I think when I've thought about this, we kind of have seen this play out over the last couple of years in the city already. And I think we could also think about recommendations versus charter amendments. So I believe where John's at is a specific charter amendment that would require this to be a placeholder. Potentially, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. Okay, so what I was going to say was we could do this as a charter amendment, which would then lock everything in. Yes. It could also be a recommendation to council that in the future they do this in a certain way. And I think we've already seen some willingness to do that 2 years ago, that it may be something that maybe council will do voluntarily and set up their own process to, I hope, allow some time to get past some of these issues where the community doesn't feel like there's been as much transparency. And, I think as you're describing, we're kind of stuck with this political process issue that we can't necessarily change, but I think encouraging council to take steps that would sort of allow the public to feel more like there is transparency. And I think also to give some different voice. I hear and I agree kind of with the idea that may bring other people out actually to be interested in filling a seat if they knew it was for a very limited period of time. There may be I think there will be this dynamic of who would be willing to serve a partial term and know they don't have to go campaign and go through an election, and others that may be interested in that election. So I kind of like the idea of potentially recommending to council that they use this caretaker recommendation versus actually changing the charter and not taking it as formal, I guess is what I'm getting at. John, do you want to?
Thank you for going there, because I think that's very productive. This is something that, frankly, council could adopt a resolution of intent, thereby painting themselves in a corner. That is a tough little place to get out of when you want to change your mind, and that's a good thing. And we give it a little test drive, and when we next entertain amendments to the charter, if it's sort of worked, then we make it a done deal. Truly paint them in a corner. So thanks for going there. And again, making the point, this is something that council could accomplish all by itself with consideration as making it for a charter amendment at a later time.
Fred?
Looking like I should opine.
I heard something that might have made, you agree?
No, I agree. I would go further. I would suggest a charter change, but I would certainly support this approach.
Okay. What about Carrie or Jeanette? I don't want to exclude you, but how does that?
I'm agreeing with Carrie a little bit, and I think you were saying people moving in and out, but trying to be optimistic, but a realist. This can also be used because the person will be appointed. It could become another, people are coming in, and it's sort of like a farm team for the next election. So people can be appointed to this caretaker role, and that then we'll see the caretaker the next election. Mm-hmm. So that was the point that I was trying to say. I know what we're trying to do. We have good intentions, but we're still working within a political process, and that incumbency can come back. And But I could just see, you were saying weaving in and out from the citizen's perspective, but I also can see that it can compound the problems that we're trying to eliminate.
Yeah, I like the way John just said, I'm sorry, just said we do have another charter review commission in 2022. So our recommendation could be something for council to take action on with the commission in 2022 to review it again, and giving you a few years to see, did they take the recommendation and go with it? And how did that, practically impact the process and the people? And if you're seeing kind of what you just described, maybe that pushes you one way or the other. I think as we've talked about a number of these topics, moving too fast, too far may be part of the challenge, and we still sort of have to see how this practically plays out. Didn't mean to interrupt you earlier.
It's okay. I was on the fence because I was on the fence. I think that the idealist in me thinks that with the placeholder option, what would be amazing to see is that would be a way that we built the bench, right? So not necessarily totally to your point, but that really it could be younger people. It could be people not necessarily.
How about older?
How
about
potentially? How about all of the people? It could be people. Well, people. No, but I'm thinking about I think, every time that there is an appointment process, right, I will speak for being a Latina, right? We want to see a Latino on council. And every time there's an appointment process, we go around and say, who's ready, right? What are we doing to build that bench so that we can have people who we would like to see on council that represent us, right? And so I think in the spirit, again, the idealist in me would love to see that this is a way that we build that bench of people who are interested politically, where I feel like sometimes I think that when we look at committees, when we look at commissions, when we look at other things, we only take into account people who are seasoned, and it tends to be the same people. And so my concern would be that in this placeholder process, what we would then look at is the same sort of people, because we would appreciate, and that's not to say that they would not bring flavor or experience or any of those things to the table, but if we're constantly choosing the same people, then we're in the same issue. We're creating, to your point, the same problem, just another sort of problem. So that's where I'm a little bit on the fence, where I think, I have challenges with the appointment process, and I think that there's parts of it that we can fix and make better. But then also this placeholder, I do appreciate it. I think it could add a fresh aspect. But I think it's about the intention and how we go about it. And that's where my reservations are. So hearing about, I felt like there were like two sides of the table, and I was the tiebreaker, but.
There's 6 of us.
True.
This could be a challenge.
It could be a challenge. But that's where I mean, and we can't, I don't know that we could go as far as to recommend that. My hope would be that in the spirit of being responsible, I mean, I would think that if you would take this on to be a placeholder, that it would be truly because you wanted to serve and you have a spirit of service, and that you would take that responsibility wholeheartedly, and that you would do a good job because you should and you want to, and you have an incredible responsibility. I just think that I would hope that we could open that up to all people.
So what if we try to ask staff to draft language that proposes this as a recommendation to council versus a charter amendment at this point, just talking out loud, that they use a process in which they will fill vacancies with a placeholder or caretaker, whatever the right terminology is, and they will not seek election in the following election. But I also think, to your point, and maybe even playing off what John said a little bit, that we could write some language that encourages them to use those opportunities to develop other ideas, to develop others that may not seek an elected term. I'm not going to use the age scenario, but it could be any version of flavor. I like that word. That, it may be people who have things they could share and help the city with, but maybe aren't interested in making long-term commitments to running for public office, or maybe they're not ready yet.
They're not ready yet.
Yeah, so I think maybe we could craft some language. So that's, excuse me, Edward's looking at me again like he has no idea what I'm saying, so we'll have to flesh this out. Okay, he'll figure that out. Okay. What does everyone think about that?
I know that These are nonpartisan elections, but, you know, I would like it specifically to say that this would be an open process, that all parties, all individuals, independents, Republicans, Democrat, Green Party, whatever, that it would be an open process for these consideration.
I would imagine, this is just me, that if you were doing this as a caretaker, people might be more apt to fill them with people that might have more flavor.
Spoken like a non-politician.
The word of the last meeting was geography.
And the reason I say
meeting
that-
is flavor.
I mean, I can see the positive, I can see the positive. But looking historically at the appointments that have been made, you know, I'm just,
Yeah.
you know, if we do that, let's at least emphasize to try to have a diversity of nonpartisan and diversity of applicants, so that it's not quiet, that it's there.
Carrie?
So just clarification, if it was in the first 2 years, if I heard you correctly, first 2 years, there's a resignation and an appointment, that person would then run head-to-head at the 2-year mark of the term, right? So would the placeholder then, so that would be the same, so if it's first 2 years, resignation and appointment, we're encouraging the placeholder just for that 2-year period, right?
They
So
could not run in that head-to-head.
you wouldn't have a scenario where, let's say, God forbid, there was, you know, something horrible happened shortly after a council member was elected, and there was a need to fill a vacancy. You don't envision a scenario in which this placeholder would serve for 4 years, right? That couldn't
No, they
happen.
wouldn't.
Okay, all right,
They would
that's good.
stand, there would be an election after the first two, worst
Yeah,
case
okay,
scenario.
right.
They would not be able to run for that, or there would be the regular election at the last two, and they would not be able, I guess is the right word, or
Okay.
asked not to, whatever, run for that election.
So we're talking about a placeholder using our current process,
Yes, I think that's,
so that they couldn't do the 4 years, if we use our current process.
Right.
Right.
Because
Right.
if there's a vacancy and it would go through the same process, and they're just the placeholder until that next
and I guess what I'm
election.
proposing is that instead of writing this into the charter, that we would ask council to make it a recommendation for their processes, so that when they're going through their process and defining what that is, that they would be saying to applicants for vacancies, you know, you would not be the candidate that whatever party would support or not support, you would not run in the next election. They'd make that commitment, and then, you know, they could run in the future, but they wouldn't run in that election, whether it's a special municipal election or the regular municipal election. I'm trying to use the right terms. Did I get that right? Okay. So is there a motion to, is there a second? Gosh, the side of the table. Wow. Okay, all those in favor on this side of the table? Aye.
Aye.
Anyone
This is just
opposed?
for language.
We're doing this in steps, yes. This is just to ask staff to draft language that would make a recommendation to council, not a charter amendment, to have a placeholder caretaker process, but also maybe think about some language that could help encourage flavor,
Diversity.
diversity.
On
yeah.
all levels.
Exactly, thank you. Flavors or diversity, all levels, however we want to say this. All right, so are we clear? Okay, I think we're gonna take a break, and we will come back, it's 3:40, we'll come back about 3:55, if that works, and then we'll talk about full-time versus part-time and review the draft language from,
I thought there were some other items we could discuss on this. I didn't know this was the total.
oh, no, we can, but I'm still gonna take a break, is that okay?
Okay, as long, because I had a question, but I thought you were like moving through. I didn't know that was the only
No, do you wanna go ahead and
topic.
ask your question?
You could take the break.
Well, I don't think Brian's gonna be able to join us after this, so
And it
maybe
was
we should,
specifically for
maybe we should
Brian.
ask the question then, so, let's stay.
You know, we started on the caretaker, but there was the other option of not filling the vacancy. And I wanted you to go over, because I want to make sure I understood what you were saying about the municipal election year and the non-municipal election year. So we have a newly elected council member, starting in 2018, resigns February 1. Would we be able to hold an election, a special election that year for that vacancy? Or would we have to hold it in 19?
The way that our charter currently works, you'd practically have to do it in 19. Now, there is the possibility in a non-presidential year of having a March special election, provided that there was no partisan issue on the ballot at the same time. The same would be true of an August special election that year.
In the even year that?
In an even year.
year.
So essentially, you've got, you have March, May, August, November. And you can hold a special election concurrent with any primary or general election. I think there are a lot of unknowns in terms of what could or could not be on the ballot in an even year, which is why you would see that cities across the state tend to favor those odd years. And I would just also note historically, I believe it was in the 93 Charter Review Commission, where we went from serving the entire unexpired term as an appointee to the midterm election. And that was triggered by a very similar situation where an individual ran for office and then stepped down shortly after being sworn in.
Okay, I just wanted, because we were talking about alternatives, and obviously leaving it open would be an alternative, not a caretaker, just leaving it vacant. So I'm trying to make sure, because that was a new one when you talked about, I remember some of that. So if we have a vacancy and we don't fill it, we could technically be holding that vacancy open for a full year in this 2018. So it would be vacant the 2018, and the first would be March or May of 2019.
That is correct. So the way that
Because
this,
it would be, in this scenario, it's the beginning of the first year of the four-year term, but it's an even year.
the way that the cities that only allow special elections, and for mayor council cities, that's 6% of those cities, they do not allow any appointment prior to that special election. I believe.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you're discussing
Yeah.
here. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them would require a special election within a certain time period, sort of the way that we do with charter amendments. But you are correct that the most likely scenario would be a special election in March of the next odd year.
So we would have a vacant position for a year and a half possibly.
If we followed our current process longer, only because we do a elimination primary and then the general for the
Yeah.
special election.
So it could possibly be a primary and then the general.
If we followed our current process, you would be looking at a vacancy for 2 years.
Okay.
Because I think where you're thinking it, I liked that idea when we first talked about it, and if there was only one member of council that had left, that seems somewhat reasonable. I think what I struggle with is we have to be prepared for all the scenarios, and what if there was a reason why 2 or 3 or 4 left? How would we practically function for, as we've kind of already talked about, we have a smaller city council in comparison to similarly sized cities. So what would be practical implications if more than one person were to?
Because we have had that tonight.
Yeah, I think we have, or at least close to.
2019, using the same scenario, we would appoint within 30 days of that resignation.
That would be correct.
And the earliest election would be primary, May?
That would be correct.
So if we went with leave the seat vacant, the odd year, we'd have early, a short term of vacancy, and in even years, we could have up to a 2-year vacancy.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you, Brian.
Any other questions for
Thank you
Brian?
for letting me get my question.
I apologize that I didn't make that clear. So before we take a break, any other questions for Brian? I believe you'll be here tomorrow, but not for the rest of our meeting today, so. Okay, hearing nothing, we will take a break and we'll come back at about 5 till 4. Thanks, everybody. We are going to continue with the discussion about full-time versus part-time. And I have one speaker slip that I'm going to allow to speak this afternoon. So we may not get to the draft language until tomorrow's meeting. And we may or may not have additional draft language before tomorrow's meeting. Do you think we will have some?
Staff will make its best effort to get you a second set of draft language per today's discussion.
And again, I think I would just reiterate that you can send feedback to staff when they send the draft language, just don't copy each other. All discussions will be here, but if you have comments back to staff that they can work on or things they need to address or can address, you're welcome to email those back to staff or call. So, all right, full-time versus part-time. I think we had some brief discussions about this in at least one of our meetings. And one of the points I just wanted to clarify, and Edward, maybe you can explain for sure, but our discussion is really about expectation of a council member and kind of what the language says about their role. This is not about compensation from what I understand. I believe that's handled separately. Can you address that process?
Yes, Chair Coe, members of the committee. In terms of what this would encompass, there are many charters throughout the country, some of which place some sort of clause that would essentially make members full-time to their position or limit their outside employment in such a way that this is your first obligation, this is the expectation of how you kind of make your living is through this position, whereas many other charters, including Columbus's, is silent on that matter. And so that has been construed to say that members of Columbus City Council are part-time and may have outside employment. And then to address the compensation of members, that's addressed through the Citizens Commission on Elected Official Pay, which convenes every 4 years. That's the body that looks at comparative data and does the analysis to say, are we compensating these individuals appropriately and consistently with peer cities throughout the country and based on local factors such as cost of living, the consumer price index, and other economic factors.
So the charter is currently silent on the issue. So if we wanted to make a recommendation to modify the charter, it could be to add language clarifying that, but that would not change the compensation of a member until the committee met again and made any determinations that it deems appropriate.
That is correct.
Okay. So questions, thoughts on this topic? Yes, Fred.
I shouldn't say this because it'll blow up, but I think this is one of the easier topics.
Okay.
The charter, as Edward just pointed out, does not restrict members of council. It does, as I understand, restrict the mayor. And I have some experience in reviewing other legal matters as to when people are restricted. Personally, I think we should leave it right where it is. Doesn't say they're full-time, doesn't say they're part-time, but if the commission thinks that they should be paid a higher salary, then the commission, there's a mechanism in place, and I wish we had those in other places to take care of this thorny issue. To restrict a member of council who is a professional doing other work part-time, to restrict a member of council who is a board member and who receives a minimal compensation for their board work, I think would be wrong. So I personally think that we leave the section alone. And in fact, I won't go there. I just corrected my thought. I think we should leave it alone, and if members of council need to have their pay adjusted, it's up to the commission.
And I think I personally agree with what you said. I don't like the idea of putting in a number of restrictions. I think you then limit the candidates and limit those that would be interested in filling this seat. And you also create unnecessary drama by deciding what is a violation of those restrictions. I wouldn't be opposed to maybe adding language, since it's silent, on addressing that, this is your primary responsibility or this is your first responsibility, something to indicate that we think that members of council should be devoting a greater amount of time to their council work than other work. Something like that, but I would definitely not, I don't think that the restrictions on specific types of work or amount of time or trying to restrict hours or those kinds of things makes any sense to me. Other thoughts? John, you leaned forward. Any?
Well, just to tag the base of full-time service, the beauty of full-time is it eliminates a lot of conflicts of interest. I don't think it's worth the candle. I'd rather submit to the risk of conflicts of interest and turn to transparency to deal with that problem. With respect to your notions there, just in your comments immediately preceding my own, voters are pretty smart people, and they sort this stuff all out. And so you have some people who maybe have only a limited time to take from their profession, but their contribution still warrants their election. And others who have a different skill set and they're prepared to work 50 hours. I think the voters sort that all out. And they've done a pretty good job of it, frankly. And so a system that gives us professionals who will give us a piece of their life, or people who are prepared to give us all of their life in the name of service, I think it's working pretty well, not so much because the words on paper, but because the voters are sorting it out and getting it right.
Thoughts, Jeanette?
I think it helps the city to have council members from various backgrounds. We're talking about the flavor, or so to speak. And if we start putting restrictions on outside employment, I mean, we're going down a rocky path. What's outside? Someone's doing tax accounting at night, or, but we can be realistic and know that people have other things that can pull away from their time. They can have young children, they can have other civic obligations. So I think looking at it, I would not want to limit it so that we would lose or narrow our applicant pool. Because looking over the years, we've had nonprofit executives, we've had business executives, we've had medical professionals, we've had entrepreneurs, we've had a variety of people willing to serve. And I would like us to continue to allow people to serve. And people work differently. I mean, sometimes just because, some people are more effective in a shorter length of time. So it's the effectiveness.
Makes a lot of sense. Carrie?
I'll pick up on that point a little bit, because I think that idea of bringing, additional voices and different perspectives to council is an important one. I think the way the compensation structure currently works, in my view, limits that in some ways, because if you're a part-time council person as it stands now, and the compensation rate, which is, I think very fair in some respects, certainly for a job that's part-time, you can only do that if that's either your full-time job in all practical purposes, or if you work in a unique profession that you can supplement your compensation and service on council with either independent contract work, you can find an arrangement that someone's going to allow you to work a flexible minimum schedule. For the vast majority of workers, those opportunities don't exist. You either work a 40-hour week job or you don't. And so, I think I would like us to talk about this a little bit further, just because, I think that the compensation structure and the time demands in some ways can limit the number of people who want to serve on council. And so, I think there are some alternatives in here that we could consider. My thought on that is, ultimately, I think maybe it was John that first planted this seed, which is that, perhaps giving the individual council members the choice between part-time and full-time is something that intrigues me. From a compensation perspective, if I remember correctly from one of the presentations, my understanding is that each council member has 2 designated staff persons. My thinking, and this is just a general thought that I'll put out there for your feedback, is if we gave a council member the opportunity to serve either full-time or part-time, they could serve part-time and keep their structure and staff structure, their compensation and staff structure the same as it is now. If they chose to go full-time, my thinking is they would have one less staff person and then use that allocated budget to increase their individual compensation. So you would effectively ensure that you have somebody there that's able to do the job and all the community outreach that's a part of the job, doesn't have to worry about figuring out a way to create some additional compensation through, independent contract work or other things, which, we've talked about. There are other issues that arise when that happens. To me, this seems like an opportunity to give the individual council member a choice, and also do it in a way that doesn't increase the overall cost of the current budget allocation. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there on the table and get some reaction to it. And I'm curious to hear what folks think.
Since my name was intoned, let me share what we were I was paying attention to. Early on, I mentioned to people that unless they've changed the law, I always worry about that, Fred, they're always changing it. There's provision, at least at one time, maybe still is in the statutes, that a county prosecutor gets to elect whether to serve full-time or part-time. And I think the statute schedules compensation at those two levels. And people might think, oh, does that turn us all into policemen, policewomen, in terms of whether they're really working full-time or part-time? But there's nothing like a whole lot of voters keeping an eye on you to keep you honest on that point. Maybe it's probably a fair criticism to say that maybe we should ask council, our staff, to focus on the county prosecutor thing and bring us back a little report on how that works, because it is a bit of a compromise that, and I have a lot of respect for your points, Carrie. So maybe we should just have that statute explained to us one more time before we go too far. But in the meantime, I think I'd suggest we press in the direction of leaving it alone. So there's really nothing for staff to do.
We've come great distance in how we view public employees. I was very pleased to see this commission set up because the level of responsibility of a council member this city size, it goes beyond being paid per meeting and whatever. So I was very happy that it's taking a very objective, professional approach. One of the questions that I had when this came up about whether or not to be part-time or full-time was the fact that was the request being placed so that full-time would put them in a different salary category. And since you said that was not the case, but I don't know if the Salary Commission looked at some of the information that you presented to us with regard to the salary range. I think that it's something that the Salary Commission probably should look at, because I don't know, in thinking about you, we're looking at a livable wage, and there are always trade-offs, because it's very difficult to establish one salary that could compensate people from different skill sets, professions. That's very difficult. So we almost have to look at the job itself, and people have to make that determination whether or not they can work within that. I think there's room to make some changes, but it's one that I think anyone going into public service, specifically for positions such as this is not an 8-to-5, 9-to-5 job. It requires extensive flexibility in hours, weekends, all of that. And I would hope that the Salary Commission would take that in consideration, because I think that's part of what this underlying discussion, because you do devote time, and it may not be 9 to 5, but the council members, I assure you, they're spending hours pouring through this legislation, whether it's 8 o'clock at night or what I used to do on Sunday afternoons. So, I think, let's be fair about this. and the perception of the amount of work that's being done. And some employers aren't agreeable to giving people that much time. But then again, so we want a livable wage, but I don't think we can have the same expectations that we can totally compensate people for their individual profession outside of council. So I think there will always be some sort of a value judgment by the independent member as to what sacrifice that they can make with regard to time.
I'm not even sure how to ask Edward these questions, kind of piggybacking off that, but could the compensation commission, whatever they're called, I'm sure I got the name right, compensation commission, could they recommend an increase based upon their sort of belief or study or conclusion that this should be full-time? Or are they constrained in some way because this charter is silent? Does that make sense?
Yes, the question makes sense. However, I'm not sure if I'm able to answer it. Their deliberations are conducted on the basis of looking at comparative information, looking at comparative cities, and kind of going into it with the knowledge that no city comparison is apples to apples. And so they have to look at these factors of, well, knowing that Seattle is a very close peer city of ours, it's also in the Pacific Northwest, and the cost of living is drastically different than the Midwest. And so I understand the question, but I can't necessarily give you an answer, yes or no. This constricts them in how they deliberate. I can't give you an answer either way.
The charter is silent on the topic. Can council do something amongst their own rules, processes, legislation potentially to define more what's expected of a council member? Is that something that they could address themselves without a charter review or charter amendment?
That's an interesting question that we would have to look into, but it seems as if the essential job description of a council member is contained in the charter, and that's to say that the legislative powers of the city are vested in a council of 7 members, and whatever that means.
I would be concerned about, I'll go back to what I said before, a council member's position, it is not a standard go in and go out. And I would be reluctant to, whatever of putting false expectations of how people do the job.
And I would argue that it almost inherently is a full-time job, even if you were part-time, whatever it may be, because just given the hours that you have and the commitments that you have to the city. And I think we would want them to operate as if they were full-time, just because, when you're not, then this is not it's, what time is that? I'm going to punch out and I got to go, right? Because something could happen, anything could happen. So I think it's difficult. I mean, which makes sense why we're silent on the issue, is just because I feel like it's difficult, especially with thinking of the salary, thinking of where, the burden that we put on people, depending upon where you are. If you're an executive somewhere and you are the breadwinner in your family, could you then afford to take, a pretty significant salary cut to serve? Would be difficult if we made that a mandate. If you do have the flexibility to have both, then, I think to the point that you were making before, I think it would be difficult I think then we could potentially X out good candidates, 1. 2, I think the other thing I was thinking of, to Carrie's point, I also think in the decision-making and thinking about staff, I almost think if you're full-time, you still need 2 staff people, because then I think you have even more work. You're taking on more work, you need more people. I mean, then, I get the halftime, because then you have these people kind of making up for the time that you're not there. But if, now I'm spending 60 or more hours a week working on something, you can tell I work for a nonprofit, because I just said a work week was 60 hours. But, then I think you need more people to help you sift through that, so.
And I think as we've kind of looked at what's the real issue, this still comes down to people, the citizens want accountability and responsiveness, and we could say they're full-time, we could dictate X hours. That isn't necessarily going to mean anyone's responsive or addressing citizen issues. That may mean they sit in an office. I mean, the problem is you can't dictate doing the right thing, sort of. And I think, sort of to your point, I was thinking the same thing, like, conceptually, I know exactly where kind of Carrie was going, but I think that is sort of true that would you have more work is kind of what I was thinking. And also, as much as staff is fantastic, and we've seen staff do a great job, citizens also want their council member. So, you know, how much is that going to offset one way or the other? And if you're taking away a staff member, I would think that would potentially impact kind of the work that could get done behind the scenes to address the issues, to do the projects and all those kinds of things. So I think we're all kind of saying the same thing, that no one's saying we should limit this or put restrictions, I don't think. I almost feel like there's a leaning towards doing nothing relative to that section of the charter. And my only thought still is, do we want to clarify in any way that it's sort of the primary? But even that, I don't know. I mean, because what does primary mean? And then do we end up in a debate about that? So sounds like I'm hearing, yes, Edward?
I did want to take a brief moment to address Committee Member Rosenberger's question, at least in concept, and we can provide some additional statistics and information regarding county prosecuting attorneys. What currently exists in Ohio Revised Code is a series of tiers. And so I can't tell you how many tiers they have, but one, their pay is prescribed based on size of the county, population-wise. So smaller counties, prosecuting attorneys get paid less than the largest counties. And within that structure, there's a second set of tiers where a prosecuting attorney can say, I have no private practice, or I do have a private practice. And so that essentially gets to, I'm saying I'm full-time or part-time, but they could still be working X number of hours at both jobs. They're just saying, because I have a private practice, I will take a lower salary from the public coffers, as opposed to, I have no private practice, so I will get paid more from my prosecuting attorney position. And if it pleases the committee, we can try to look up and see if we can find that schedule and how that's separated out by pay. But in concept, I believe that would address your question.
Yeah, that's my recollection of how it works, so good for you, good for me, since we both seem to remember it. I'm intrigued by what sort of step up you get by declaring yourself a full-time prosecutor. Is it a 10% bump? Is it a 50% bump? That'd be an interesting insight.
I'll have to look at that section of revised code.
We could just have that for either tomorrow or next
Yeah,
I still feel like the majority of us are, if not all, kind of silent. I mean, Carrie, I think you had the most specific alternative, so.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the will of the committee,
But would you have to change, for your suggestion, would the charter have to specify that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what would kick it in. I mean, I think there's some value in having a full-time council member for the reasons I stated. I also think that if one of our objective is to bring the council members closer to the people, I think giving them the ability to be there full-time and do some of the constituent work that their staff does could accomplish that, but
That's kind of why I was asking the questions about what does the compensation commission allow to take into account? Because I think you're right, that if compensation was adjusted potentially, then more people would be able to make that their full-time priority. So I almost feel like it's not us, it's sort of what does the compensation commission, because they're the ones who are going to have to address compensation, but can council provide that commission some guidance, or, this is what we're expecting of our members today, or in essence, the charter is silent on the issue, but we've deemed this to be full-time, or we've deemed this to be I don't see why, I need someone to help me, why we would have to change the charter or even add to it for council to be able to set some of its own expectations.
Couldn't we give that charge in some of our
Like, just a general
recommendations?
recommendation?
Yeah. Because I think Carrie's right. I mean, there are people who can't afford to serve on council because they can't give up the primary income. And then there are people that you would like to serve on council and you don't want to make them give up their primary income. So, we're trying to come up with the balance to
So would we
open
want
it up.
Staff to create language that would be just a recommendation to council, or a recommendation even just in general versus a charter recommendation? Is that, are you just saying like maybe
Well,
flesh
I'm
out
thinking
language that
because
would?
it's going back to the compensation, because the compensation committee, I mean, they've set salaries for like 4 years with it's like a 4-year period, isn't it? With automatic cost of living adjustments. So my question was, did they take into consideration some of the things that were presented in here? You know,
Could
and
we
this.
get staff to come back tomorrow with, I know we had it, you gave it to us, but the information on how it works, what do they take into consideration? Who all does it affect? Well, we know it affects council, so I guess it doesn't matter.
And I think, and you could probably look it up, but I think the directions when it was changed in the charter, was it specifically given the compensation committee a charge to compare with other municipal offices? That rings a bell with me.
Yes, I do believe that's part of their charge, is to
So-
look at other cities.
So, so that's in the charter language, so I don't know.
I feel like we're recommending that the compensation committee take these things into account or
Exactly.
look at it versus us recommending
Yeah.
any action outside of they need to look at this more.
Yeah,
Is that fair?
what Carrie was saying, looking at the fact that someone may want to, I mean, how do we
Yeah.
adjust to be competitive,
Yeah,
to offer a competitive salary for someone to do this full-time?
right. And I like the idea of giving council that flexibility, so you maximize the number of people based on their employment status who can come in and serve. I would also just say one other thing, which is, whether it's a specific recommendation about, technically what needs to be changed to make changes in this area, or a broader recommendation, I'm fine either way, I mean, if there's consensus. I also would just say that I also feel like, and I said this before, but to the extent that we can be a little bit more specific, I think that's what we're being asked to do, rather than just say, someone else should look at this. So I don't want to kick the can too far, but I also don't really want to bite off more than we can chew either, so to use two little metaphors for you.
So why don't we make a motion, and ask staff to provide some additional data on maybe what that spread looks like for the prosecutor's election of private cases or not, private practice or not. There was a second thing that was.
Can they take into consideration?
Oh, yeah, like sort of what.
Could they implement Carrie's recommendation, I guess would be a basic question.
So kind of, can we craft language around recommendations to the compensation commission or to the information provided to them to consider? Is that making any sense?
Could you repeat the second part so that I'm clear? Because I might have an answer to the question I heard, but I'm not sure it's the question I heard.
Okay, I don't even know what I said now, but
I
I think what we're saying, yeah.
I guess if the question is, could the pay commission create this tiered system for council members? I believe the answer is no, because it's beyond the scope of what they're going to be charged to do, which is to allow council to adopt an ordinance that sets the pay for elected officials. That's the pay commission's charge in the charter, so they cannot exceed that.
So they couldn't
Scope.
elect that structure, but I think we could sort of craft specific language, sort of to Carrie's point, around that they should take into account sort of these expectations, or sort of asking in some way, maybe they already are, that they're looking at, this being potentially full-time or inconsistent hours, and we want to create the most diverse group possible. I think we're looking for more language, and I think to Carrie's point, more specific language around that, but I don't think anyone's recommending it be a charter amendment, and I think it's more directed at that commission to take into account how they deem compensation. Sort of, so when they're looking at comparable cities, maybe they're not just saying, oh, we're part-time, so we should be a lot less than the city. Maybe looking at the fact that we're not necessarily part-time, we're silent on the issue. And this is what we expect of council members. Just read my mind, take what you heard.
Right.
Madam Chair.
Yes, John.
There's a lot of ways to serve full-time. It doesn't have to be on city council. if you really like public service, there's all sorts of postings around this building. You can sign up and get a pretty good paycheck, and you can serve. I don't think we should bend this all out of shape to make this, force this fit.
I think we'll at least go from there. Okay. Well, it's 4:33, so I'm going to have our speaker address the group. Wait, Edward has a question first.
I think you were asking for a motion.
Oh, yes, I was. Thank you. It's 4:30.
Whatever she said.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. So now it's your time to make some magic and figure out what we said. So we're going to have our speaker, and then we will be back tomorrow. So the agenda items will be, for sure, we're going to review the draft language on the size and structure of council that we already have. And if staff's able to provide additional draft language on today's topics, we'll move into some of that tomorrow as well. So I do want to let you address the committee. I am generally familiar with what you're going to say, so it's kind of outside the scope of what we're dealing with. So I just want you to limit your time, but please address the members of the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Coe. And in fact, I'm not sure it is outside the scope, but let me just say that one of the issues you brought up in the area commission's meeting, is this off? No, it's working. Oh, in the area commission meeting I attended, there are, and in the last meeting last week, you are looking into ways to maybe help area commissions as well as, in our case, the civic associations, because really the purpose of this charter, from everything I've read and from what Mr. Harden said, is to how to best serve all residents in every corner of the city. We have a rather unusual situation in that on Billingsley Road, we are residents who are across the street from commercial, which means the big business auto dealerships would like to expand, and looking at it as a zoning-only issue, they're disregarding the fact that there's the 200-foot setback that's been there established to protect the residents for many years. There's no precedent for them building into that. And they, in all of the hearings we went to, luckily we were very glad to say that Mayor Ginther, then president of the council, as well as Councilmember Tyson, whose quotes are on page 2 of this little handout, worked to say that they didn't want to have this back on the agenda until they knew the resident issues are resolved. But we're looking at processes and procedures here, and in fact, what we're finding is now the lawyer is actually going through city, going through zoning, all on his own, and then going in private meetings with council member Page to try to say he has resolved our issues. And there's a conflict of interest there that we brought up at the ethics hearing where I was the first speaker in February. Tracy was there, and 30 minutes into the tape on that hearing, the issue is that council wanted to have the lawyer go back to buyers to try to come up with solutions. Instead, he is expanded his role to go to council and everybody else to say he's resolved all of our issues, and they're totally unresolved. In fact, he's left the key issue, which is the lack of precedent, off the list of issues, and the LED lighting, which is not just for residents here. We're talking about many stakeholders. If we have 100 extra LED lights in one parking lot that is expanded, and then 5 other dealerships can put more, and all of these face I-270 as well as Billingsley Road, are distracting to drivers. There's no way to just use a rule of 125 feet, 4 little houses of people get notified, and that this can get passed and this can all happen. There's tremendous dramatic impact. So what I think here is, I think your committee can come up with procedures to, it appears that civic associations are not formally recognized, and even though our civic association had memos, and also in the Dan Tobin down the road, they said this was not to become a precedent for, if they had approved Dan Tobin, they didn't want to see that as a precedent for our neighborhood, because Dan Tobin is across from warehouse buildings. But that is in fact what's really happening. So what's happening here is the council's trying to help us, but there's nowhere where the city staff is actually not following statutory requirements. There's many errors and omissions in the whole process, and that because we're not represented, we have to go through each at-large member of council And at the same time, because it's not on the agenda yet, it's like, well, we tabled it indefinitely. But if it gets put on the agenda, that's an unfair process for residents versus commercial interests, because the attorney for the commercial interests gets to speak, he gets to do a rebuttal, and we have to stand there and wait for the vote. We have no way to actually do anything but show up for 3 minutes. We also put our materials in for the record in 2 different hearings, and what happens to those? Nothing happens. I had, even when we, in the ethics hearing, we reported about these types of issues, the unfairness of the 125-foot rule in an area, issues that involve many more stakeholders than a few residents. I brought up the fact that in the ethics hearing, the whole issue was to make commercial folks accountable to show when the big lobbies were, to show that they register for their lobbying interests. But in fact, when you have issues involving residents, citizens have no ability to know if certain council members have had their campaigns supported heavily by the auto dealerships, the construction lobbies, and everybody else. So if this is becoming public information, citizens have the right too. So I realize I'm not sure how you define scope of making sure, but my list here and what's in the packet are just examples of communications we provided where from the beginning we mentioned these issues and why they're not being represented. So I thought you guys have been very appreciative of research and all the big presentations everyone's given. So I'm trying to give you some samples of a real-time issue where there is no accountability to respond and transparency, even though council members want to do this. And there are no written procedures or processes for us to obtain the prior public records related to the original setback, which protects us. And we're hopeful now. We finally learned we have. No one even knew we had Mr. Nivens, who is going to help me as a neighborhood liaison. He's going to help me try to go through and have responses. We're hopeful that each council member, if we go individually to them, which Ms. Page has asked them to meet with us, will support our interests and not allow this to get back on. But what constitutes putting it on? The lawyer is putting amendments in which make it a totally different application from what it is. He should not be allowed to do that without going through all the hearing process and starting from scratch, because basically it's not just adding parking. There's a 7,000 square foot building put in there. There's many LED lights not mentioned, and all kinds of other issues that will drastically affect the value not only of our homes, but the quality of life for the citizens and the travelers who heavily use Billingsley. It's the main artery for the Fire Station 27 to get to Dublin in these parts of the city. And for medical aid, we pay Dublin school taxes, and the Dublin buses use our street, and the tremendous amount of congestion caused by not only this expansion to provide deliveries of 73 spaces worth of cars, but for all the other dealerships to be doing the same.
Said outside the scope. I think the specific issues you're talking about are outside the scope of what we can address. I think questions about accountability and responsiveness and transparency are exactly what we're trying to get at, and I think you were here last week. So our recommendations ultimately, I think, related to area commissions and how the city structures it to have that neighborhood voice was part of that. So we appreciate your comments, and we'll include them with all of our information. Thank
I
you.
meant these as examples because it's too general. You can't make recommendations when you don't see exactly how some of this is operating. And so I hope you appreciate the fact that we've been doing all this. So, and I thank you all, and I thank
you.
the city, and I thank the council members. We're hopeful that these types of things can have processes and procedures that are public and that are available to all, even citizens in the many areas that have no commission or no civic association at all.
We understand. Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
Yes, Carrie.
Just for maybe Edward, so just on the kind of zoning process. Right, I mean, those are the kind of changes that if there were going to be some specific changes and processes and procedures around zoning, those are not things that would be done in the charter, right?
Yes, the changes to the zoning process would happen through ordinance.
Right, right. Okay, I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
Yes.
Is there a second? Second. All those in favor? Aye. All right, we are adjourned. See you all tomorrow.